Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise to take note of a comprehensive and important report, the Closing the Gap. The Prime Minister.
Senator Scullion, point of order. You should now move to take note of the document.
I move to take note of Closing the Gap, Prime Minister's report of 2012.
Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. A very important report. Indigenous disadvantage and disconnect is a reality in many parts of Australia and requires a commitment from not only individuals but governments at all levels of Australia to address. Now, when the previous Prime Minister, Prime Minister Rudd, made the commitment to produce a report on the first day of Parliament in every parliamentary sittings each year on the status of closing the gap, this commitment was certainly welcomed across the political divide. It was viewed as an opportunity to assess how government programs are working, what the community acceptance involvement was, and whether or not we were actually closing the gap. Now, unfortunately, most of the reports to date have concentrated on inputs, how much money has been allocated or spent, and how many initiatives have been announced. And I'd have to say, in the defence of the Labor Party, probably in the first couple of years I'd understand, Mr Deputy President, why that might be the case. We have to get a database. But we've certainly been at this some time now, and it's become apparent that the government now seems to believe that the hard work actually stops when the announcement's been made. And I think all Australians would know that the opposite is in fact quite true. For example, the government's $100 million Indigenous anti-smoking initiative. Now, we know exactly what's being spent, but we've got, of course, no real idea about how that's actually working. We don't know, neither does the government, exactly the details of what's happening. We know the details of how much money is invested. We have absolutely no details at all about how many people have stopped smoking, how many people are attempting to stop smoking, the variety of communication mechanisms between Indigenous Australia and the government. So, why can't we actually be told about the effect of the program? We need this amount of money, $100 million, Mr Deputy President. One would expect that they would be able to, after spending that much money, actually know what works and doesn't work, because by the time we get to the end of the program it's going to be too hard to be able to make any changes. So we definitely need some interim targets as to the long-term closing the gap targets of 10 to 20 years actually mean nothing if we can't actually assess how we're going last year or the next year. So the importance of trend lines, particularly in the closing the gap, is something I don't think we've developed fast enough, and certainly something we really need. Now, for example, the halving of the gap on Year 12 completion by 2020. So right at the moment we measure how many people graduate this year, and then we try to do a projection, which is, in my view, pretty worthless. There's a much better way to do that. And what we need to do is to measure how many kids are in and passing grade 5 this year, because they're going to be the same students that are actually going through Year 12 in 2020. And the reason that I use that particular one is that through school attendance and NAPLAN results for that particular age group, it would indicate that we've already failed to meet the 2020 targets, because the number of kids who are being retained in Year 5 and actually passing Year 5, we're not even at 50%, so clearly we've failed the target already. So we don't have to wait till 2020 and say, oh, we've got it wrong, let's go and do something more about it. So I think it's very, very important that we change that approach. The Closing the Gap reports needs to highlight all of this information, as well as the plenty of glossy brochures that it's got in it, plenty of pictures, very little qualitative data, and I think that needs to change. And it does a disservice both to the Australian public who want action and the Indigenous Australians who deserve action. The Closing the Gap report should also contain data that describes where we are right now. Data not designed to attribute blame or shame people, but to remind Australia why we need to work so hard to address disadvantage and disconnection. Data, disturbing as it may be to some, certainly like that provided by the Children's Commissioner, Dr Howard Barth. This data was provided in Dr Barth's submission to the Stronger Futures Legislation Senate inquiry. And I think it's a salient reminder about why we must continue to invest or intervene in Indigenous affairs. The Australia Early Development Index, the AEDI, provides a population-based developmental assessment of children in their first year of schooling. It explains that those with multiple developmental vulnerabilities will require special assistance in order to benefit from regular schooling and all the lifelong benefits that schooling provides. Now, across Australia, to get an idea, those children that have multiple developmental vulnerabilities, and one of the fundamentals of that, they understand, is that if you're raised in an environment of feeling safe and confident, then you won't fall into this multiple developmental vulnerability. So across Australia, 11.8% of children have multiple developmental vulnerability. Within the Northern Territory, Mr Acting Deputy President, 46.8%, that's nearly half of all Indigenous children, have developmental vulnerabilities on more than one developmental domain. Half of the Indigenous children across the entire territory. But in remote communities, the number of children assessed with the developmental vulnerabilities is far worse. Research has indicated that close to 60% of the children in the Northern Territory Emergency Response Zone, that's the remote communities and the town camps, have multiple developmental vulnerabilities, and that is as they enter the school system. So 60% before they enter the school system are significantly behind the eight ball. Mr Acting Deputy President, if you look at the NAPLAN results, the attendance results that this is all to do with, we understand why they find it so very hard to complete an education, or in their case, in many cases, we've seen even up to year 5, even in our sense, attempt to start one. Now, it's a lot harder to identify and access these children when we need to make a concerted effort to help because they're in these remote communities. Developmental vulnerabilities are significant, but there are a lot of other significant issues that contribute to the disadvantage and disconnect experienced by Indigenous Australians. One of those is the exposure to alcohol abuse and general violence. Dr Barth states, one of the hazards facing children that receives less attention because it's somewhat hard to measure, difficult to talk about publicly, is the impact of the exposure of children to chronic family and community violence. And you remember I said a little earlier, Mr Acting Deputy President, about the multiple presentation of dysfunctionality and the association with feeling safe. And I think that when we look at this area of vulnerability, I think one of the most important areas of vulnerability is not only the exposure to general abuse and violence of the children, but of the whole family. And just a statistic, most night patrols that were funded as part of the Northern Territory Emergency Response are the first response to individual and community violence. In 2010, the patrols responded, this is for a target population of 29,000 adults. This is to a violent episode, 100,000 incidents in 2010. Recent Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data indicate that Indigenous people in the Northern Territory are hospitalised for assault at twice the rate of Indigenous people in other parts of Australia. Of particular concern is the vulnerability of women and children. Indigenous women are hospitalised for assault at an alarming rate, 69 times that of other women in the Northern Territory. Around 2.5% of all Indigenous women in the Northern Territory are hospitalised for assault each year. Now, we're going to make some comparisons. For example, in New South Wales, there are 2.5 times more Indigenous people than there are in the Northern Territory. In the 2-year period to 2008, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare records that 635 Indigenous women were hospitalised for assault. That's in New South Wales. For the same period, for half the number of people in the Northern Territory, 1,729 women were hospitalised. In many of these violent incidents, Mr Acting Deputy President, children are present, witnessing, experiencing and absorbing the impact of this violence. I welcome the Closing the Gap report, but as I've indicated, the document is more noteworthy for what it doesn't say than for what it does.